Welcome to WooEnglish. In this story, you'll learn English through clear and simple sentences. Feel free to leave comments and share your thoughts. If you enjoy the story, please press the like button to support us. It really helps. This story is for educational purposes. We aim to help you improve your English while enjoying an inspiring tale about Alexander the Great. His journey offers valuable lessons about leadership, ambition, and the impact of one's actions. But we do not encourage or glorify any actions in the story. Let's begin the journey together. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Legend. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city of Pella, casting a warm golden light on the marble walls of the royal palace. It was a morning like any other in the capital of Macedonia, but on this day, something extraordinary was about to happen. The people of Pella were unaware that this day, in the year 356 BC, would mark the birth of a legend, Alexander the Great. Inside the grand palace, the air was thick with anticipation. Servants moved quickly and quietly, their footsteps barely making a sound on the cool stone floors. In the royal chambers, Queen Olympias was in labor. She was a strong woman, known for her fiery spirit and deep devotion to the gods. On this day, she would give birth to a son who would change the course of history. As the first cries of the newborn echoed through the halls, a sense of awe spread among the palace staff. King Philip II, the powerful ruler of Macedonia, rushed to his wife's side. He looked down at the tiny infant in her arms, and a wave of pride and hope washed over him. This child, they believed, was destined for greatness. From the very beginning, Alexander was no ordinary child. His parents, Philip and Olympias, were convinced that their son had a special destiny. Olympias, in particular, believed that Alexander was the son of Zeus, the king of the gods. She often told him stories of his divine origin, filling his young mind with visions of greatness and power. Growing up in the palace, Alexander was surrounded by wealth and luxury. The royal gardens were filled with exotic plants and animals from distant lands, and the palace itself was a marvel of architecture, with grand halls and intricate mosaics. But despite the opulence around him, Alexander was not a child who was easily satisfied with material things. Even as a boy, he had a restless energy, a burning desire to learn and to explore the world beyond the palace walls. King Philip, a seasoned warrior and a shrewd politician, knew that his son needed more than just stories and legends to prepare him for the challenges ahead. He arranged for Alexander to be tutored by some of the finest minds in Greece. The most famous of these was Aristotle, the great philosopher. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander studied philosophy, science, mathematics, and literature. He learned about the great heroes of Greek mythology, the principles of logic, and the mysteries of the natural world. Aristotle was a patient and wise teacher, and he saw in Alexander a bright and curious mind. He encouraged the young prince to question everything, to seek knowledge for its own sake. But Aristotle also knew that Alexander was destined to be more than just a scholar. He was the heir to a kingdom, and one day he would have to lead his people in battle. To prepare him for this role, Philip also ensured that Alexander received rigorous military training. From a young age, Alexander learned the art of war. He practiced swordsmanship, archery, and horse riding. He studied the tactics of famous generals and learned how to command troops. Philip often took him to watch military exercises, and Alexander would stand by his father's side, observing every move, every decision. One of the most important moments in Alexander's early life came when he was just 12 years old. Philip had received a gift, a magnificent horse named Bucephalus. The horse was wild and untamed, and none of the king's men could ride him. Philip was ready to send the horse away, but young Alexander stepped forward. "I will tame this horse," he said confidently. The court watched in amazement as the boy approached the powerful animal. Alexander noticed that Bucephalus was afraid of his own shadow, so he turned the horse towards the sun, where the shadow could no longer frighten him. With gentle but firm hands, Alexander calmed the horse and mounted him. Bucephalus did not resist. Instead, he responded to Alexander's touch, and together they rode across the field, fast and free. When they returned, the crowd erupted in applause. King Philip was overcome with pride. He embraced his son and said, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." This incident with Bucephalus was more than just a display of Alexander's skill with horses. It was a sign of his unique ability to understand and control even the wildest of creatures. It was also a glimpse into his future, his willingness to face challenges head-on, to find solutions where others saw only obstacles, and to lead with confidence and courage. As Alexander grew older, his bond with his father grew stronger. Philip saw in him the qualities of a great leader, someone who could unite the Greek states and expand the Macedonian Empire. But their relationship was not without tension. Philip was a powerful and ambitious king, and as Alexander became a young man, he began to chafe under his father's authority. He wanted to prove himself, to step out of his father's shadow and create his own legacy. Despite these tensions, Philip and Alexander shared a mutual respect. They both knew that their destinies were intertwined, and that together they could achieve great things. Philip's vision was to unite all of Greece under his rule, and to lead a grand campaign against the Persian Empire. It was a dream that would become Alexander's mission. But even as Alexander prepared for the future, he was still a young man with the passions and emotions of youth. He was close to his mother, Olympias, who continued to fill his mind with stories of his divine ancestry. This connection to the gods, combined with his education and training, gave Alexander a sense of purpose, a belief that he was destined to achieve greatness. As he approached adulthood, Alexander began to take on more responsibilities. He accompanied his father on military campaigns, gaining first-hand experience in leadership and strategy. He also started to build his own circle of friends and advisors, men who would later become his most trusted generals. The city of Pella, with its bustling markets and busy streets, was a vibrant place during Alexander's youth. Merchants from all over the world came to trade their goods, bringing with them stories of distant lands and exotic cultures. Alexander was fascinated by these tales, and he longed to see these places for himself. He dreamed of traveling to the far corners of the earth, of discovering new worlds and conquering them. In these early years, the seeds of Alexander's ambition were planted. He was not content with simply inheriting his father's kingdom. He wanted more, much more. He wanted to be remembered as one of the greatest leaders in history, a man who would change the world. As the years passed, the boy who was born in the royal palace of Pella grew into a young man, ready to take on the challenges that lay ahead. The stage was set for his journey, a journey that would take him from the hills of Macedonia to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Persia to the plains of India. Alexander the Great was ready to begin his conquest of the world. And so, with the support of his parents, the wisdom of his teachers, and the loyalty of his friends, Alexander embarked on the path that would lead him to greatness. The world was waiting, and Alexander was ready to make his mark. The legend of Alexander the Great had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Education of a Prince. The sun rose steadily over the rolling hills of Macedonia, casting a soft golden light on the landscape. In the heart of this kingdom, a young prince named Alexander began another day of lessons that would shape the course of his life. Unlike other boys his age, who might have spent their days playing or exploring, Alexander's time was filled with intense study and training. He was not just any child. He was the future king, and his education was crucial to his destiny. King Philip II Alexander's father, when he was a wise and ambitious ruler, he knew that his son needed the best possible education to prepare him for the challenges of leadership. Philip believed that a strong mind was just as important as a strong body, and he wanted his son to be equipped with both. To ensure this, he called upon the greatest mind of the age, Aristotle. Aristotle was a renowned philosopher, a man of immense knowledge and wisdom. He had studied under Plato, another great philosopher, and had developed his own ideas about the world. When Philip invited him to Pella to tutor Alexander, Aristotle accepted the challenge. He saw in the young prince a bright, eager student who was ready to absorb the lessons of the world. From the moment Aristotle arrived, Alexander's education took on a new intensity. The lessons were not just about reading and writing, though those were important. Aristotle believed in teaching his students to think for themselves, to question the world around them, and to seek knowledge in all its forms. Knowledge, Aristotle often said to Alexander, is the key to power. A ruler must understand the world, its people, and its laws, if he is to govern wisely. The lessons took place in a quiet, shaded grove outside the palace, where the air was filled with the scent of pine trees and the songs of birds. It was here, in this peaceful setting, that Aristotle guided Alexander through the wonders of philosophy, science, and logic. They began with the basics, the nature of the world, and the elements that composed it. Aristotle explained how the earth, water, air, and fire came together to create everything in existence. He taught Alexander about the stars in the sky, the plants and animals on the earth, and the workings of the human body. But the lessons did not stop there. Aristotle also introduced Alexander to the great thinkers of the past, like Socrates and Plato. They discussed ideas about justice, virtue, and the best way to live one's life. Aristotle encouraged Alexander to think deeply about these topics, to ask questions, and to form his own opinions. One day, as they sat under the shade of an olive tree, Aristotle posed a question that would stay with Alexander for the rest of his life. What is the purpose of life, Alexander? Aristotle asked. Alexander thought for a moment, his young face serious. To achieve greatness, he replied, echoing what his father had often told him. Aristotle smiled, but his eyes were thoughtful. Greatness is important, but it is not the only purpose. True greatness comes not just from conquering lands and winning battles, but from understanding the world and improving it for others. A wise ruler seeks to know not only how to lead, but also why he leads. These words struck a chord with Alexander. He realized that his education was not just about preparing him to be a warrior, but also about making him a thinker, a philosopher king who would rule with wisdom as well as strength. In addition to philosophy, Aristotle taught Alexander about the natural world. They studied the plants and animals around them, observing how they lived and interacted. Aristotle explained the concept of classification, showing Alexander how to group different species based on their characteristics. This scientific approach fascinated Alexander, who loved to explore and discover new things. But Aristotle's teachings were not limited to science and philosophy. He also taught Alexander about the art of rhetoric, the skill of speaking and persuading others. A ruler, Aristotle explained, must be able to communicate his ideas clearly and effectively. He must inspire his people, win their trust, and guide them with his words. To practice, Alexander often delivered speeches in front of Aristotle, who would critique his performance. Over time, Alexander became a skilled orator, able to speak with confidence and conviction. This ability would later serve him well as a leader, helping him to unite his soldiers and rally them in times of need. One of the most important aspects of Alexander's education was his training in ethics. Aristotle believed that a good ruler must also be a good person. He taught Alexander about the virtues, courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom, and how they were essential for a ruler. Courage is not just about facing danger, Aristotle explained, but about knowing when to take risks and when to be cautious. Temperance is about balance, about not giving in to excesses. Justice means treating others fairly, and wisdom is the ability to make the right decisions. Alexander took these lessons to heart. He began to understand that being a king was not just about power, but also about responsibility. He would need to be fair, brave, and wise if he was to lead his people well. In addition to his intellectual studies, Alexander's education included physical training. He continued to practice his military skills, sword fighting, archery, and riding. Aristotle encouraged him to see the connection between the mind and the body, teaching him that a healthy body was necessary for a sharp mind. As the years passed, Alexander grew not only in knowledge, but also in character. Under Aristotle's guidance, he became more thoughtful, more reflective. He learned to see the world not just as a place to conquer, but as a complex system of people, ideas, and forces that he needed to understand. One day, after a particularly intense lesson on ethics, Aristotle gave Alexander a gift. It was a copy of the Iliad, the great epic poem by Homer that told the story of the Trojan War. Aristotle had written notes in the margins, sharing his thoughts on the text. "This," Aristotle said, handing the book to Alexander, is the story of Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. But it is also a story about honor, glory, and the consequences of our actions. Read it carefully and learn from it. Alexander took the book with reverence. He knew that the Iliad was more than just a story. It was a guide to the kind of leader he wanted to be. He read it often, drawing inspiration from the characters and their struggles. By the time Alexander's education with Aristotle came to an end, he was no longer just a boy with dreams of conquest. He was a young man with a deep understanding of the world, a sharp mind, and a clear sense of purpose. He was ready to take on the challenges of leadership, armed with the knowledge and wisdom that Aristotle had given him. As he prepared to leave Pella and step onto the stage of history, Alexander knew that his education had shaped him into the leader he was destined to become. He was ready to lead, to conquer, and to rule, not just with strength, but with wisdom. The lessons of Aristotle would stay with him throughout his life, guiding him as he embarked on his journey to greatness. And so, with a heart full of knowledge and a mind sharpened by years of study, Alexander the Great began the next chapter of his extraordinary life. The world was vast, and he was ready to explore it, not just as a conqueror, but as a philosopher king, guided by the teachings of his mentor, Aristotle. Chapter 3. The First Battle. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the plains of Chaeronea. The air was still cool, but there was a tension in the atmosphere, a sense that something monumental was about to happen. In the distance, the sounds of an army preparing for battle could be heard. Soldiers sharpening their swords, horses neighing, and commanders shouting orders. This was the day that Alexander, the young prince of Macedonia, would face his first true test on the battlefield. Alexander was only 18 years old, but he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had been trained by the best teachers, studied the strategies of the greatest generals, and had even led small skirmishes before. But this battle was different. This was the Battle of Chaeronea, a clash between the forces of Macedonia, led by his father, King Philip II, and a coalition of Greek city-states determined to resist Macedonian domination. As the army gathered, Alexander stood beside his father, watching the troops form their lines. The Macedonian army was disciplined and well-trained, a formidable force that had conquered many lands. But the Greeks were fierce warriors too, and they were fighting to defend their freedom. The outcome of this battle would shape the future of Greece and Macedonia. King Philip turned to his son, his expression serious. "Alexander," he said, "today you will lead the cavalry. Remember what you have learned. Be brave, be smart, and lead your men with courage." Alexander nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been waiting for this opportunity to prove himself, to show his father and his soldiers that he was not just a prince, but a warrior. He mounted his horse, Bucephalus, the magnificent steed that had become his loyal companion. With a deep breath, he prepared himself for what was to come. The battlefield stretched out before him, a vast expanse of open land with the river Cephissus running nearby. On the other side, the Greek forces were already assembling. Alexander could see their banners waving in the wind, hear the distant sounds of their war cries. The Greeks had taken up a strong position, with their heavy infantry, the hoplites, forming a solid wall of shields and spears. As the sun rose higher in the sky, both armies were ready. The Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers armed with long spears called sarissas, began to advance slowly, like a massive machine rolling forward. The ground shook with the weight of thousands of men moving in unison. Alexander, leading the cavalry on the left flank, watched closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. The battle began with a thunderous clash of metal as the Macedonian phalanx collided with the Greek hoplites. Spears thrust forward, shields slammed together, and the air was filled with the sounds of battle. Shouts of command, cries of pain, the ring of swords and shields. It was a chaotic, terrifying scene, but Alexander knew he had to stay focused. From his position on the flank, he could see that the Greek forces were holding their ground. They were strong and determined, refusing to give an inch. But then Alexander noticed something, an opportunity. The Greek line was stretched thin, and there was a gap forming between their center and their right flank. This was his moment. Alexander raised his sword, signaling his cavalry to charge. With a shout, he spurred Bucephalus forward, and the horse leapt into action. The Macedonian cavalry followed, a wave of horsemen thundering across the battlefield. The ground flew beneath them as they closed the distance between themselves and the Greek forces. As they approached the gap in the Greek line, Alexander could see the surprise and fear in the eyes of the enemy soldiers. They had not expected an attack from this direction, and they were unprepared. With a fierce battle cry, Alexander led his men into the fray, crashing into the Greek lines with the full force of the cavalry. The impact was devastating. The Greek soldiers, caught off guard, were thrown into disarray. Alexander fought with all his might, slashing with his sword, urging his men forward. He could feel the power of the charge, the energy of the battle coursing through him. This was what he had been born to do. But the battle was far from over. The Greeks, though surprised, were not defeated. They fought back fiercely, trying to close the gap and repel the cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting, his sword clashing against enemy shields, his horse rearing and kicking. He could feel the heat of battle all around him, the press of bodies, the roar of combat. In the midst of the chaos, Alexander saw a group of Greek soldiers regrouping, trying to form a defensive line. He knew that if they succeeded, the momentum of the charge would be lost. He had to act quickly. With a shout, he rallied his men, directing them to attack the Greeks before they could reform. The cavalry surged forward again, smashing into the Greek soldiers with renewed force. Alexander was at the front, his sword flashing as he cut down one enemy after another. The Greeks were overwhelmed, their line broken. They began to fall back, retreating in the face of the relentless Macedonian assault. As the Greek forces crumbled, Alexander could see that the tide of the battle had turned. The Macedonian phalanx, bolstered by the success of the cavalry, was pushing forward with renewed vigor. The Greek army was in full retreat, their lines shattered, their morale broken. But Alexander did not let up. He pursued the fleeing soldiers, driving them from the battlefield. His heart was pounding, his blood was up, and he could feel the thrill of victory in every stride of his horse. This was his first battle, and he had proven himself as a leader, a warrior, and a prince of Macedonia. Finally, the battle was over. The Greeks had been defeated, their forces scattered. The Macedonian army stood victorious on the plains of Chaeronea. Alexander rode back to his father, his face flushed with triumph. King Philip, seeing his son return victorious, smiled with pride. "You fought well today, Alexander," he said. "You have shown that you are ready to lead." Alexander nodded, still catching his breath. He had faced his first true test on the battlefield, and he had passed. But he knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more battles to come, more challenges to face. But, for now, he could savor the victory, knowing that he had taken the first step on the path to greatness. As the Macedonian army celebrated its victory, Alexander looked out over the battlefield. The sun was setting, casting a red glow over the land. He knew that this day would be remembered, not just as the day he proved himself in battle, but as the day he began his journey to become one of the greatest leaders the world had ever known. And so, the young prince of Macedonia, with his first taste of victory, prepared to face the future. The Battle of Chaeronea was over, but the story of Alexander the Great was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Death of a King. The evening sun cast long shadows over the city of Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedonia. It was a time of celebration, as King Philip II, and the powerful ruler of Macedonia, was about to marry his seventh wife, Cleopatra. The palace was filled with guests from all corners of Greece, each one eager to witness the grand event. Laughter and music filled the air, and the mood was one of joy and festivity. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered, unseen by most. Alexander, the king's son, watched the preparations with a mix of emotions. He had always been close to his father, but their relationship had grown more complicated as Alexander matured. King Philip was a formidable leader, respected and feared by many. But his ambition sometimes overshadowed his role as a father. The marriage to Cleopatra was a clear indication of Philip's desire to secure his legacy, potentially threatening Alexander's position as the heir to the throne. Despite these tensions, Alexander knew the importance of this day. His father had worked tirelessly to unite the Greek city-states under Macedonian rule, and this marriage was another step in solidifying his power. As the festivities continued, Alexander remained on the sidelines, his thoughts drifting between pride in his father's achievements and concern for what the future might hold. The ceremony began as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the palace courtyard. King Philip, dressed in his finest robes, walked proudly through the assembled guests, acknowledging their cheers with a wave of his hand. Cleopatra, young and beautiful, stood by his side, her eyes shining with anticipation. It was a moment of triumph for Philip, a man who had risen from a minor king to one of the most powerful rulers in the world. But as the king reached the center of the courtyard, where the altar stood, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The music stopped, and a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time, as if the very air had thickened with tension. Then, without warning, a man stepped forward from the crowd, his face twisted with anger and determination. Before anyone could react, the man lunged at Philip, a dagger flashing in his hand. The blade struck the king in the chest, and Philip staggered, his eyes wide with shock and pain. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, as the king fell to the ground, clutching at the wound that would soon end his life. Alexander, who had been watching from a distance, felt as if the world had suddenly tilted. Everything around him blurred, and all he could see was his father lying on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. He wanted to scream, to rush forward and protect the man who had been both his mentor and his rival, but he was frozen in place, unable to move. The assassin, a man named Pausanias, was quickly subdued by the king's guards, but it was too late. King Philip II, the man who had united Greece and built an empire, was dead. The news spread through the palace like wildfire, turning the festive atmosphere into one of fear and confusion. Guests hurried to leave, fearing for their own lives, while the royal guards scrambled to secure the palace. Amidst the chaos, Alexander was finally able to move. He rushed to his father's side, kneeling beside the fallen king. Philip's eyes were open, but the life was quickly fading from them. He looked up at Alexander, his expression a mixture of pain and regret. With his last breath, he tried to speak, but the words were lost in a final, shuddering gasp. The king's hand fell to the ground, and his eyes closed forever. Alexander sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His father, the man who had shaped his entire life, was gone. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he felt as if he were suffocating under the enormity of it all. But there was no time for grief. As the reality of the situation set in, Alexander knew that he had to act quickly. The death of a king, especially one as powerful as Philip, would send shockwaves through the kingdom and beyond. Already, whispers of treachery and betrayal were spreading among the courtiers. Some would see this as an opportunity to seize power for themselves, while others would look to Alexander for leadership. He stood up, his face pale but determined. He could not allow himself to be paralyzed by fear or sorrow. The kingdom was now his responsibility, and he had to secure it before others could challenge his right to the throne. As the night deepened, Alexander took charge. He ordered the palace guards to secure the gates and ensure that no one could leave without his permission. He then summoned his most trusted advisors and generals, men who had served his father loyally. They gathered in a small, dimly lit room, their faces grim as they awaited Alexander's instructions. "I know this is a shock to all of us," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But we cannot afford to show weakness. My father's death will not be the end of our kingdom. We must remain strong and united." The men around him nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening with resolve. They had seen Alexander's potential on the battlefield, and now they saw that same strength in his leadership. Alexander continued, "We must first deal with the assassin. Pausanias acted alone, but we cannot rule out the possibility that others were involved. I want a full investigation. No one leaves this palace until we know the truth." The room was silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. The death of a king was not just a personal tragedy for Alexander. It was a crisis that could destabilize the entire kingdom. But Alexander was determined not to let that happen. He had learned from his father's example, and he knew that leadership meant making difficult decisions, even in the face of personal loss. In the days that followed, Alexander moved quickly to secure his position. He ordered a grand funeral for King Philip, a ceremony that would honor his father's achievements and remind the people of Macedonia of the strength of their royal family. The funeral was held in Aegae, where Philip's body was laid to rest in a magnificent tomb, surrounded by the symbols of his power and glory. As the people mourned their king, Alexander took steps to eliminate any threats to his rule. He confronted those who might challenge him, either by force or by negotiation. Some were persuaded by his determination and vision for the future, while others were dealt with more harshly. Alexander's actions were swift and decisive, and soon it became clear that he was in full control. The political turmoil that had threatened to tear the kingdom apart was quelled, and Alexander emerged as the undisputed ruler of Macedonia. But even as he secured his throne, the loss of his father weighed heavily on him. Philip's death had not only changed the course of Alexander's life, but it had also marked the end of an era. The man who had built an empire was gone, and now it was up to Alexander to continue his legacy. In the quiet moments after the funeral, when the court was silent and the palace empty, Alexander would often find himself standing before his father's tomb, reflecting on the past and contemplating the future. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face it. The death of King Philip II had shaken the foundations of Macedonia, but from the rubble a new leader had emerged. Alexander, the young prince who had just lost his father, was now a king. And with the weight of the crown on his head and the memory of his father in his heart, he was ready to take on the world. The story of Alexander the Great was only beginning, but it was a story that would be written in the blood, sweat, and tears of a young man who had been thrust into greatness by the death of a king. Chapter 5. Ascending the Throne. The news of King Philip II's death spread like wildfire across Macedonia, and soon throughout all of Greece. The powerful king who had united the Greek city-states under his rule was gone. For many, it was a moment of uncertainty. Who would lead them now? Who would step into the shoes of the man who had built an empire? The answer came quickly. At just 20 years old, Alexander, the son of Philip, ascended the throne. His youth might have been a cause for concern, but those who knew him well understood that he was no ordinary young man. Alexander had been trained for this moment his entire life. The education he received from Aristotle, the experience he gained on the battlefield, and the lessons learned at his father's side had all prepared him for this day. Yet, despite his preparation, the road ahead was not easy. Philip's sudden death had left a power vacuum, and there were many who would challenge Alexander's right to rule. The kingdom was filled with whispers of rebellion, plots, and conspiracies. Some of the nobles and generals who had served under Philip now saw an opportunity to seize power for themselves. They doubted that a young and untested king could maintain control over the vast and diverse empire that Philip had built. Alexander was well aware of these threats. He knew that his first task as king was to secure his position and eliminate any rivals who might challenge his authority. He had to act quickly and decisively, showing both his allies and his enemies that he was in command. The day after his father's funeral, Alexander called a meeting of his most trusted advisors and generals. They gathered in the palace in Agay, their faces serious as they awaited the new king's words. Alexander stood before them, his expression calm but intense. He spoke with a quiet confidence that belied his age. "Philip is dead," he began, his voice steady. "But his legacy will not die with him. We are Macedonians, and we are united by more than just a man. We are united by our strength, our courage, and our vision for a greater world. I will continue my father's work, and I will lead us to even greater heights." The room was silent as Alexander paused, letting his words sink in. He knew that some in the room harbored doubts, and others perhaps even plotted against him. But he also knew that he had to show strength, now more than ever. "I understand that some of you may question my ability to lead," he continued, his eyes sweeping over the assembled men. "But let me assure you, I will not tolerate disloyalty. This kingdom needs stability, and I will ensure that it has it. Those who stand with me will be rewarded, and those who oppose me will face the consequences." The message was clear. Alexander would not hesitate to crush any opposition, no matter how powerful. He knew that to maintain control, he had to be ruthless when necessary. His father had taught him that a king must sometimes be feared as well as loved. In the days that followed, Alexander took swift action to secure his rule. He began by consolidating his power within Macedonia. He rewarded those who had been loyal to his father and who now pledged their loyalty to him. But he also moved quickly to eliminate any potential threats. Several nobles and generals who were suspected of plotting against him were arrested and executed. This decisive action sent a clear message to all who might think of challenging the new king. Next, Alexander turned his attention to the Greek city-states, many of which had been subdued by his father, but were now considering rebellion. They saw Philip's death as an opportunity to break free from Macedonian control. But Alexander, determined to maintain the unity that his father had achieved, acted swiftly. He marched his army south through the narrow passes and rugged terrain, showing the Greeks that Macedonia was still strong and that he was not a ruler to be underestimated. One of the first cities to challenge Alexander's rule was Thebes, a powerful and proud city-state that had long resisted Macedonian influence. The Thebans, encouraged by rumors of unrest in Macedonia, believed they could overthrow their new king. But Alexander, showing the military prowess he had inherited from his father, quickly laid siege to the city. The Theban resistance was fierce, but Alexander's army, disciplined and well-trained, eventually broke through the city's defenses. When Thebes fell, Alexander made an example of it. The city was razed to the ground, and its people were either killed or sold into slavery. It was a harsh punishment, but it served its purpose. The other Greek city-states, seeing the fate of Thebes, quickly submitted to Alexander's rule. They realized that the young king was not to be trifled with. With Greece secured, Alexander turned his attention to the north, where the tribes of Thrace and Illyria were threatening Macedonia's borders. These tribes had always been a thorn in Macedonia's side, and they saw Philip's death as a chance to raid and plunder. But Alexander was not about to let them threaten his kingdom. He led his army into the wild and mountainous regions where these tribes lived, defeating them in a series of swift and brutal campaigns. The Thracians and Illyrians, who had thought they could challenge the new king, were quickly subdued. By the end of the year, Alexander had solidified his control over all of Macedonia and Greece. His swift and decisive actions had crushed any hopes of rebellion, and his enemies had either been eliminated or forced into submission. The young king had proven that he was not only a capable leader, but also a force to be reckoned with. But even as Alexander secured his throne, he was already looking beyond the borders of his kingdom. His father's dream had been to lead a grand campaign against the Persian Empire, the greatest power in the known world. It was a dream that Philip had not lived to see fulfilled, but Alexander was determined to make it a reality. He began preparing for the campaign with the same determination and resolve that had marked his rise to power. He gathered his advisors and generals, planning every detail of the invasion. He knew that the Persian Empire was vast and powerful, but he also believed that with the right strategy and the right men, it could be conquered. As Alexander stood on the balcony of his palace, overlooking the city of Pella, he felt the weight of his new responsibilities, but he also felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just the son of Philip. He was Alexander, king of Macedonia, and he had a destiny to fulfill. The throne was his, and with it the power to change the world. But Alexander knew that his journey had only just begun. Ahead lay challenges greater than any he had faced so far, but he was ready to meet them head-on. The world was vast, and Alexander was determined to leave his mark on it. With the strength of a king and the vision of a conqueror, Alexander began to prepare for the next chapter of his life. The throne of Macedonia was secure, but his ambitions reached far beyond its borders. The young king was ready to take on the world, to fulfill the dreams of his father, and to carve his own name into the annals of history. The legend of Alexander the Great was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Conquest of Persia. The time had come. Alexander, now firmly established as the king of Macedonia and ruler of Greece, stood on the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia. Across the waters lay the vast and powerful Persian Empire, the greatest adversary the world had ever known. The Persian kings had ruled for centuries, their lands stretching from the Aegean Sea to the distant mountains of India. Conquering this empire would be the ultimate test of Alexander's ambition, courage, and military genius. The sun rose over the calm waters, casting a golden light on Alexander's army as they prepared to cross into Asia. Thousands of soldiers, dressed in gleaming armor, stood ready, their faces set with determination. They knew that they were about to embark on a campaign that would decide the fate of the world. At the head of this army was Alexander, young but resolute, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was about to lead his men into the unknown, to challenge an empire that had humbled so many before him. As the ships set sail, cutting through the waves, Alexander felt a mixture of excitement and tension. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had prepared for his entire life. The Persian Empire was a formidable enemy, but Alexander believed in his cause, and he believed in his men. He knew that victory would not come easily, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The crossing was swift, and soon Alexander and his army landed on the shores of Asia Minor, the westernmost part of the Persian Empire. As he stepped onto the sandy beach, Alexander paused, bending down to scoop up a handful of earth. He let the grains of sand slip through his fingers, a symbolic gesture that marked the beginning of his conquest. From this moment on, there was no turning back. The first major challenge of the campaign came at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian forces, led by local satraps, had gathered to confront Alexander and his army. They had positioned themselves on the opposite bank of the river, confident that the rushing waters would slow the Macedonian advance. But Alexander was not deterred. He knew that speed and surprise were his greatest allies. With a shout, Alexander led his cavalry into the river, urging his men to follow. The water was deep, and the current was strong, but the Macedonians pressed forward, determined to reach the other side. The Persians, taken aback by the boldness of the attack, struggled to form a coherent defense. As Alexander and his men emerged from the river, dripping wet but full of energy, they charged into the Persian lines with a ferocity that caught their enemies off guard. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but Alexander's leadership and the discipline of his troops soon turned the tide in their favor. The Persian forces were overwhelmed, and many fled the battlefield in panic. Those who remained were cut down by the relentless Macedonian advance. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, and the Persians had been decisively defeated. The victory at the Granicus River was Alexander's first major triumph in Asia, and it sent a clear message to the Persian king, Darius III. A new and formidable challenger had arrived. But the Battle of the Granicus was only the beginning. As Alexander's army marched deeper into Asia Minor, they encountered more resistance from Persian forces. The landscape was rugged and unfamiliar, with mountains, deserts, and treacherous rivers blocking their path. The scorching heat of the sun beat down on the soldiers, and the long marches took their toll. Yet, despite these challenges, Alexander's army pressed on, driven by their leader's unyielding determination. The next major confrontation came at the Battle of Issus, a narrow plain between the mountains and the sea. It was here that Alexander would face Darius III himself, who had gathered a massive army to crush the Macedonian invaders. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome of this battle would determine the future of the campaign. As the two armies faced each other, the tension was palpable. Darius's forces vastly outnumbered Alexander's, and the Persian king had every reason to believe that he would emerge victorious. But Alexander, studying the terrain and the disposition of the Persian troops, saw an opportunity. The narrowness of the battlefield meant that Darius could not use the full strength of his army, and Alexander planned to exploit this weakness. With a cry, Alexander led his troops into battle, charging straight for the heart of the Persian lines. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long spears and tight formations, advanced steadily, cutting through the Persian ranks. Meanwhile, Alexander, riding Bucephalus, his trusted horse, led the cavalry on a daring flanking maneuver. The Persians, unprepared for the speed and precision of the Macedonian attack, began to falter. In the heat of the battle, Alexander spotted Darius's chariot, surrounded by the king's personal guards. Seizing the moment, Alexander drove his cavalry forward, cutting through the Persian defenders in a desperate attempt to reach the king. Darius, seeing the danger, panicked and fled the battlefield, leaving his army in disarray. The sight of their king's retreat demoralized the Persian soldiers, and soon they were fleeing in every direction. The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander. Darius had escaped, but the Persian army was shattered, and the way was open for Alexander to continue his advance. In the aftermath of the battle, Alexander captured Darius's family, his wife, mother, and daughters. Despite their status as prisoners, Alexander treated them with respect and care, earning the admiration of his own men and the respect of many Persians. This act of kindness was not just a display of chivalry. It was a calculated move to win the hearts of the Persian people. With the Persian forces in disarray, Alexander continued his march through the empire. He liberated the cities of the coast, which had long been under Persian control, and received their gratitude and support. But Alexander's ambitions went beyond merely defeating Darius. He aimed to conquer the entire Persian Empire, to take the great cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, and to become the ruler of all Asia. As Alexander's army moved further east, the challenges grew. The distances were vast, the terrain more difficult, and the Persian forces, though weakened, were still a threat. But Alexander was undeterred. He inspired his men with his own courage, leading from the front, sharing in their hardships, and never asking them to endure anything he would not face himself. In the spring of 330 BC, Alexander finally reached the city of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. The city was a symbol of Persian power and wealth, with its grand palaces, towering columns, and vast treasures. As Alexander entered the city, he knew that this was more than just a military victory. It was the culmination of his campaign, the moment when the might of Persia was brought to its knees. Yet, even in triumph, there was tragedy. As Alexander's soldiers roamed the streets of Persepolis, looting and celebrating, a fire broke out in the royal palace. The flames quickly spread, engulfing the magnificent city in a blaze that consumed its grandeur. The reasons for the fire remain unclear. Some say it was accidental. Others claim it was a deliberate act of revenge against the Persians. Whatever the cause, the destruction of Persepolis marked the end of an era. Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, but his journey was far from over. The campaign had taken its toll on his men, and there were still distant lands to explore, new challenges to face. The conquest of Persia had demonstrated Alexander's brilliance as a military leader, but it also revealed his insatiable ambition. He was not content with what he had achieved. He wanted more, always more. As the dust settled on the ruins of Persepolis, Alexander looked east, toward the unknown lands that lay beyond. The world was vast, and he was determined to see it all, to conquer it all. His quest for glory had brought him this far, and he knew that it would drive him even further. The conquest of Persia was a turning point in Alexander's life. He had defeated the greatest empire of his time, captured its cities, and taken its wealth. But the true legacy of his campaign was yet to be written. The world was changing, and Alexander was at the center of that change. He was no longer just a king. He was a legend in the making, a figure who would be remembered for centuries to come. And so, with Persia behind him and the unknown before him, Alexander prepared to continue his journey. The conquest of Persia was complete, but the story of Alexander the Great was far from over. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Alexander the Great here on WooEnglish. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and comment. Your feedback means a lot to us and helps us bring you more inspiring content. Chapter 7. The Siege of Tyre. The city of Tyre stood proudly on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, its walls towering over the waves that crashed against its sturdy foundations. For centuries, Tyre had been a powerful and wealthy city, known for its skilled sailors and rich trade routes. But now, in 332 BC, it was about to face a challenge unlike any it had ever known. The armies of Alexander the Great had arrived, and Alexander was determined to bring the city under his control. Tyre was different from any other city Alexander had encountered. It was not just a city on the mainland. It was divided into two parts. The old city was on the coast, while the newer, more fortified part of the city was located on an island half a mile offshore. This made Tyre almost impossible to conquer. Its high walls were surrounded by water, and its strong navy controlled the sea. The people of Tyre believed that their city was invincible. But Alexander was not one to be easily discouraged. He knew that taking Tyre was crucial to securing the eastern Mediterranean and cutting off Persian supply lines. The challenge was great, but Alexander had faced great challenges before. He was determined to bring Tyre to its knees, no matter what it took. The siege began with a demand. Alexander sent envoys to the city asking the Tyrians to surrender and allow him to enter the city to offer a sacrifice to their god, Melkart, whom he associated with the Greek hero Heracles. But the Tyrians, confident in their defenses, refused. They believed that their island fortress would keep them safe from the Macedonian army. Alexander's response was swift and decisive. If Tyre would not surrender, then he would take it by force. The first challenge was getting to the island itself. The sea stood between Alexander's army and the walls of Tyre, a natural barrier that seemed impossible to cross. But Alexander was not deterred. He ordered his men to build a causeway, a massive structure of earth and stone that would stretch from the mainland to the island. It was a bold and daring plan, one that would require immense effort and ingenuity. Day by day, the Macedonian soldiers worked tirelessly, piling stones and earth into the sea, slowly extending the causeway toward the island. It was grueling work, and the men faced constant danger from the Tyrian navy, which launched attacks to disrupt the construction. The Tyrians used their ships to hurl fire and stones at the workers, trying to halt their progress. But Alexander's men persisted, driven by their leader's determination. As the causeway neared the island, the Tyrians intensified their efforts to stop it. They sent out ships equipped with large catapults to bombard the workers, and they even filled a ship with flammable materials, setting it ablaze and sending it toward the causeway to destroy it. The burning ship crashed into the structure, causing massive damage and setting back the Macedonian efforts. But Alexander did not give up. He ordered the causeway to be rebuilt, stronger and wider than before. He also realized that he would need to control the sea if he was to succeed. With this in mind, Alexander called upon the fleets of his allies, the cities of Phoenicia and Cyprus, to provide ships for his campaign. These ships, combined with his own forces, gave him the naval power he needed to challenge Tyre's dominance of the waters. With the causeway rebuilt and his fleet in place, Alexander launched a full-scale assault on the city. The Macedonian navy, supported by siege towers mounted on ships, attacked the walls of Tyre from the sea, while the causeway allowed his soldiers to bring their battering rams and siege engines to bear on the walls from the land. The battle was fierce and bloody, with both sides fighting with all their might. The Tyrians defended their city with incredible bravery. They poured hot sand and boiling liquids onto the attackers, used cranes to drop heavy stones on the siege towers, and fought back with everything they had. But slowly, the relentless pressure of Alexander's forces began to wear them down. After months of relentless siege, the walls of Tyre finally began to crumble. Alexander's men broke through the defenses, and the Macedonian army poured into the city. The fighting continued in the streets as the Tyrians made their last stand, but the outcome was inevitable. Tyre, the great and proud city, had fallen. The capture of Tyre was a significant victory for Alexander, but it came at a great cost. The siege had lasted 7 long months, and it had tested the endurance and ingenuity of his army like never before. But through sheer determination and strategic brilliance, Alexander had achieved what many thought impossible. In the aftermath of the siege, Alexander allowed his soldiers to loot the city as a reward for their hard work and sacrifice. Many of the Tyrians who had survived the assault were either killed or sold into slavery, a harsh punishment for their resistance. The city itself was left in ruins, a stark reminder of the consequences of defying Alexander the Great. Despite the destruction, Alexander's treatment of the Tyrian king and his family was notably different. He spared their lives and treated them with respect, understanding the importance of maintaining his image as a fair and just ruler, even in the face of such a hard-won victory. The fall of Tyre sent shockwaves throughout the region. The other cities of the eastern Mediterranean, seeing what had happened to Tyre, quickly submitted to Alexander's rule. The siege had not only secured Alexander's control over the coast, but had also demonstrated to the world the lengths he was willing to go to achieve his goals. As Alexander stood on the ashes of Tyre, he knew that this victory was more than just another step in his conquest of the Persian Empire. It was a symbol of his relentless pursuit of his destiny, his refusal to accept defeat, and his ability to overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The siege of Tyre had tested him as a leader, and he had emerged stronger, more determined than ever, to achieve his vision of a world united under his rule. But as always, Alexander's mind was already turning to the next challenge. Ahead of him lay the rest of the Persian Empire, with its vast cities and armies still to be conquered. The siege of Tyre was a victory, but it was also a reminder that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. Yet Alexander was ready. The world was his to conquer, and nothing would stand in his way. The story of Alexander the Great continued, with each victory bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. The siege of Tyre had been a crucial chapter in that story, a chapter that would be remembered for its persistence, its ingenuity, and the sheer willpower that had brought one of the greatest cities of the ancient world to to its knees. Chapter 8. The Founding of Alexandria. The sun was setting over the Egyptian coast, casting a warm, golden light across the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The air was filled with the sounds of waves gently lapping against the shore, and in the distance, the silhouettes of palm trees swayed in the breeze. It was a peaceful scene, but for Alexander the Great, it was the beginning of something much larger, a vision that would shape the future of his empire and the world. In 331 BC, after his successful campaigns across the Persian Empire and the conquest of Egypt, Alexander arrived at the site that would become one of his greatest legacies, the city of Alexandria. He had come to Egypt not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler with a grand vision. He saw Egypt's potential as the gateway between the East and the West, a land rich in history and resources, where different cultures could come together under his rule. But Alexander was not content with merely ruling Egypt. He wanted to leave a mark that would last for centuries. He dreamed of building a city that would serve as a symbol of his power and his vision for a unified empire. This city would not just be a place of commerce and trade, but a center of culture, learning, and innovation, a place where the knowledge of the world could be gathered and shared. The site he chose for this new city was carefully selected. It was located on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, near the mouth of the Nile River. The location was ideal for trade, with easy access to the sea and the fertile lands of the Nile Delta. But more than that, it was a place where East could meet West, where the cultures of Greece and Egypt could blend to create something new and extraordinary. As Alexander stood on the sandy shore, he could already see the city in his mind's eye. He envisioned wide streets lined with grand buildings, a bustling port filled with ships from every corner of the known world, and towering structures that would inspire awe in all who saw them. But most importantly, he imagined a city that would be a beacon of knowledge, a place where scholars, philosophers, and scientists could come together to learn from one another and advance the wisdom of humankind. To bring this vision to life, Alexander called upon the best architects and engineers of his time. Among them was Dinocrates, a renowned architect from Macedonia, who shared Alexander's passion for grand designs. Together they began to plan the layout of the city, starting with the main streets, which would be laid out in a grid pattern. This design was revolutionary for its time, allowing for efficient movement of people and goods, and providing a sense of order and harmony. The main avenue, known as the Canopic Way, would run from east to west, connecting the port to the heart of the city. This wide, straight street would be lined with temples, marketplaces, and public buildings, serving as the city's main artery. At the center of the city, Alexander planned to build a grand palace where he could govern and receive visitors from across his empire. But the true heart of Alexandria, as Alexander imagined it, would be the Library of Alexandria. This would not be just any library, but the greatest repository of knowledge the world had ever seen. Alexander dreamed of filling its shelves with scrolls and manuscripts from every culture, preserving the wisdom of the past and encouraging the pursuit of new ideas. The library would be a place where scholars from Greece, Egypt, and beyond could come to study and exchange ideas, fostering a spirit of learning and innovation that would drive the progress of civilization. As construction of the city began, Alexander was deeply involved in every aspect of the project. He inspected the work regularly, offering his guidance and making adjustments to the plans as needed. He was not just building a city, he was building his legacy. Every stone that was laid, every building that rose, was a step closer to realizing his dream of a united and enlightened empire. Despite the challenges of building a city from scratch, the work progressed rapidly. The natural harbor was expanded to accommodate the growing number of ships that would come to trade and bring goods from across the Mediterranean. Temples were constructed to honor the gods of both Greece and Egypt, symbolizing the blending of cultures that Alexander envisioned. Public baths, theaters, and markets began to take shape, each adding to the life and vibrancy of the new city. As the city grew, so did its population. People from all over the world, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others, flocked to Alexandria, drawn by the opportunities it offered. Merchants came to trade, scholars to study, and artisans to create. The city quickly became a melting pot of cultures, a place where different traditions and ideas could mix and thrive. This diversity was exactly what Alexander had hoped for, and it reinforced his belief in the power of unity and cooperation. But while Alexandria was a symbol of Alexander's vision for the future, it was also a reminder of the fragility of human endeavors. As the city neared completion, Alexander knew that his time in Egypt was drawing to a close. He had other lands to conquer, other challenges to face, but he was confident that Alexandria would endure long after he was gone, a testament to his ambition and his dream of a better world. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander made one final visit to the city. He walked through its streets, now bustling with activity, and visited the sites that had once existed only in his imagination. As he stood by the harbor, watching the ships come and go, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Alexandria was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, a city that would stand as a beacon of knowledge and culture for generations to come. Alexander left Egypt to continue his conquests, but the city of Alexandria remained behind, growing and prospering. Over the centuries, it would become one of the most important cities in the ancient world, a center of learning, culture, and trade. The Library of Alexandria would attract scholars from all over the world, and the city would become a symbol of the blending of cultures that Alexander had envisioned. In the end, Alexandria was more than just a city. It was a reflection of Alexander's greatest dream, a world united by knowledge, culture, and shared ideals. Though Alexander's life was one of constant movement and conquest, Alexandria was a place where his legacy could take root and flourish, a lasting monument to the power of vision and the possibility of a better world. As Alexander rode away from the city, he carried with him the knowledge that he had created something truly remarkable. Alexandria was a testament to his belief that the future could be shaped by those with the courage to dream and the determination to build. It was a city born from a vision, and it would stand as a symbol of that vision for centuries to come. And so, the story of Alexander the Great continued, with Alexandria as a shining example of his ambition and his hope for the future. The city would grow, thrive, and inspire, just as its founder had intended, a reminder that even in a world of war and conquest, there could be places where knowledge and culture were celebrated, where different peoples could come together to build something greater than themselves. Chapter 9. The March to India. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the vast and rugged landscape of what is now modern-day Pakistan. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with dust as Alexander and his army marched onward. This was no ordinary march. It was a journey into the unknown, a venture into lands that no Greek had ever seen before. For Alexander, it was the beginning of a new chapter in his quest to conquer the world, the march to India. After the victory in Persia, many of Alexander's men believed that their long campaign might finally be over. They had crossed deserts, fought countless battles, and conquered the mighty Persian Empire. But Alexander's ambitions knew no bounds. He had heard tales of the rich and mysterious lands to the east, lands filled with wonders and treasures beyond imagination. He wanted to see these lands for himself, to bring them under his rule, and to push the boundaries of his empire to the very edge of the known world. The march to India was not just a military campaign, it was an adventure, a journey into a world that was strange and unfamiliar. As Alexander's army moved deeper into the eastern territories, they encountered new challenges at every turn. The terrain was harsh and varied. One day they would be crossing burning deserts. The next, they would be hacking their way through dense, steamy jungles. The soldiers faced sweltering heat, torrential rains, and unfamiliar diseases that took a heavy toll on their numbers. But the most daunting challenge of all was the people they encountered. The lands of India were ruled by powerful kings and warlords, each with their own armies and fortresses. These were not simple tribesmen, but seasoned warriors who knew the land well and were determined to defend their homes against the foreign invaders. One of the most formidable of these rulers was King Porus, who ruled a kingdom located near the Hydaspes River. Porus was a giant of a man, known for his strength and bravery. He had heard of Alexander's approach and prepared to meet him in battle. The stage was set for one of the most famous confrontations in Alexander's career, the Battle of the Hydaspes River. The battle took place during the monsoon season when the Hydaspes River was swollen with rain and flowing fast. Porus had positioned his army on the far side of the river, confident that the raging waters would slow down the Macedonian advance. His forces included a large number of war elephants, fearsome beasts that were trained to charge into enemy lines, trampling soldiers underfoot and striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. But Alexander was not easily intimidated. He knew that a direct assault across the river would be too risky, so he devised a plan to outmaneuver Porus. Under the cover of darkness, he led a portion of his army upstream to a point where the river was narrower and could be crossed more easily. The crossing was treacherous. The soldiers had to wade through deep, fast-moving water, all the while knowing that discovery could mean disaster. But they made it to the other side undetected, setting the stage for a surprise attack. At dawn, Alexander launched his assault. His main force, still on the other side of the river, attacked Porus's front lines, drawing his attention and forcing him to commit his troops. At the same time, Alexander's flanking force, which had crossed the river during the night, struck from the side, catching the Indian army off guard. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with the war elephants charging into the Macedonian lines, their huge tusks and powerful trunks wreaking havoc. But Alexander's men, though frightened by the sight of the elephants, held their ground. They used long spears to attack the elephants' legs, trying to bring the massive animals down. Archers targeted the riders on the elephants' backs, and soon the once unstoppable beasts began to panic, turning back and trampling their own soldiers in the confusion. Amidst the chaos, Alexander himself rode into the thick of the battle, his presence inspiring his men to fight with even greater determination. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Macedonian army slowly began to gain the upper hand. The Indian forces, seeing their lines break, started to retreat, and the battle turned into a rout. But King Porus did not flee. He stood his ground, fighting with incredible bravery, even as the tide of battle turned against him. Mounted on his war elephant, Porus continued to lead his men, refusing to surrender even when all hope seemed lost. His courage and determination left a deep impression on Alexander, who watched the Indian king with a growing sense of respect. Finally, as the battle neared its end, Porus was surrounded and captured. Wounded and exhausted, he was brought before Alexander. The two leaders, one a conqueror and the other a defeated king, faced each other for the first time. Alexander, who admired bravery above all else, asked Porus how he wished to be treated. The Indian king, still proud even in defeat, responded simply, "Like a king." Impressed by Porus's dignity and valor, Alexander agreed. He not only spared Porus's life, but also allowed him to retain his kingdom, making him an ally rather than a subject. This act of respect and magnanimity was typical of Alexander, who believed that great leaders should honor those who fought bravely, even if they were enemies. The Battle of the Hydaspes River marked a significant victory for Alexander, but it was also a turning point in his campaign. The battle had been won, but it had come at a great cost. Many of his soldiers had died, and those who survived were weary and homesick. They had marched thousands of miles, fought in countless battles, and now they were deep in a land that was alien and unforgiving. As they continued to push further into India, the challenges only grew. The monsoon rains turned the roads to mud, making travel slow and difficult. The dense jungles were filled with dangerous animals and insects, and the local resistance became fiercer as they moved deeper into the subcontinent. For the first time, some of Alexander's men began to question whether the endless march was worth the cost. Alexander, too, was beginning to feel the strain. The march to India had tested him as a leader and as a man. He had faced dangers and challenges that no other Greek had ever encountered, and he had emerged victorious. But even Alexander could sense that the limits of his men's endurance were being reached. After a particularly grueling march through the dense jungle, Alexander called his generals together. He listened as they voiced the concerns of the soldiers, their desire to return home, and their fear that the campaign had gone too far. For the first time, Alexander saw that his army, the very force that had carried him to so many victories, was on the verge of collapse. Reluctantly, Alexander made the decision to turn back. The march to India, though filled with victories and conquests, had reached its end. The journey had taken them to the edge of the known world, but now it was time to return. As they began the long march back, Alexander looked out over the vast and unfamiliar landscape of India. He had come further than any Greek before him, had seen wonders and faced challenges that few could imagine. The march to India had been an adventure, a test of his leadership and his vision. It had been a journey filled with danger, but also with discovery and growth. The story of Alexander the Great was far from over, but the march to India would remain one of its most remarkable chapters, a testament to his ambition, his courage, and his unyielding desire to push the boundaries of the known world. As the army made its way back to the west, the memories of the Indian campaign would stay with them, a reminder of the price of greatness and the power of a dream that reached beyond the horizon. Chapter 10. The Return Home. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain as Alexander and his army marched slowly onward. It had been years since they had left Macedonia, and in that time they had seen and done more than most men could dream of. They had crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and conquered mighty empires. But now, as they turned their faces westward, the excitement of conquest had faded. What remained was a deep, aching weariness, a longing for home. The decision to return had not been easy for Alexander. His ambition had driven him to push ever farther, to explore the edges of the known world. But even he could not ignore the reality that his army was exhausted, their bodies and spirits worn down by years of relentless campaigning. The march through India had tested them all, and though they had emerged victorious, the cost had been high. Now, as they began the long journey back to Macedonia, the challenges were far from over. The route Alexander chose would take them through some of the most inhospitable terrain they had ever encountered. The Gedrosian Desert. This vast, barren wasteland stretched for hundreds of miles, with little water, scarce food, and temperatures that soared during the day and plummeted at night. It was a landscape that seemed determined to break the spirit of anyone who dared to cross it. As the army entered the desert, the reality of their situation quickly became apparent. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the sand beneath their feet into a searing furnace. The wind, when it blew, carried with it stinging grains of sand that bit into their skin and filled their mouths with dust. The soldiers' armor, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden, trapping the heat and making every step a struggle. Water was scarce, and what little they found was often brackish and barely drinkable. The men grew weaker by the day, their strength sapped by dehydration and hunger. Horses and pack animals began to die, their bodies left behind in the sand as grim markers of the army's progress. The desert seemed to stretch on endlessly with no sign of relief. Despite the hardships, Alexander marched with his men, sharing in their suffering. He refused special treatment, walking alongside his soldiers and enduring the same thirst and fatigue that they did. His presence was a source of inspiration. But even he could not lift the heavy burden that weighed on the hearts of his men. At night, when the temperature dropped and the desert became eerily quiet, the soldiers would gather around small fires, trying to stay warm. They spoke in hushed voices of home, of the families and loved ones they had left behind so many years ago. For some, the memories were all that kept them going, a distant hope that gave them the strength to take another step, to endure another day. But as the days turned into weeks, the toll of the desert became too much for some. Men who had fought bravely in battle, who had faced down enemies without fear, now succumbed to the relentless heat and the crushing exhaustion. They fell where they stood, unable to take another step, their bodies claimed by the unforgiving sands. It was a slow, agonizing death, and each loss was felt deeply by the survivors. Alexandre, too, felt the weight of these deaths. He had led his men to glory, but now he was leading them through a trial that seemed to have no end. He knew that they were suffering because of his decisions. And though he tried to keep his resolve, there were moments when the burden of leadership felt almost too heavy to bear. One day, as the army stumbled across a small oasis, the men rushed forward, desperate for water. They drank greedily, ignoring the brackish taste, their bodies craving the moisture. Alexandre, as always, held back, letting his men drink first. A soldier, seeing this, filled a small helmet with water and brought it to him. The water was precious, a rare gift in the desert, and the soldier offered it to Alexandre with reverence. But Alexandre, looking at the parched faces of his men, knew that he could not accept it. He lifted the helmet, as if to drink, and then poured the water onto the ground. The soldiers watched in silence, understanding the message. If they could not drink, neither would their king. This act of self-sacrifice renewed their determination, if only for a little while. The march continued, the endless days blending together as the army pressed on, driven by the hope that eventually the desert would end and they would find themselves on the road back to Macedonia. But the Gedrosian desert was not yet finished with them. One night, as the army camped under the open sky, a fierce sandstorm blew in. The wind howled, whipping the sand into a blinding, suffocating cloud. Tents were torn from the ground, and men huddled together, covering their faces and praying for the storm to pass. It was a night of terror, a reminder that the desert was a force of nature that could not be tamed or conquered. When the storm finally subsided, the camp was in disarray. Supplies had been lost, and more men had perished, their bodies buried by the shifting sands. But Alexandre refused to give in to despair. He rallied his men, urging them to continue, to hold on just a little longer. He promised them that they were close to the edge of the desert, that soon they would see the green fields of Persia again, and from there it would be only a matter of time before they reached home. And then, one day, as the sun began to rise, they saw it, the end of the desert. In the distance, the land began to change, the barren sand giving way to the first signs of vegetation. The soldiers, weary and broken, felt a surge of hope. They had survived the Gedrosian desert, a trial that had pushed them to the very limits of their endurance. The journey was not over, but the worst was behind them. As they left the desert behind, the mood of the army began to lift. They still faced many miles of marching, but each step now brought them closer to home. The thought of seeing Macedonia again, of reuniting with their families, gave them the strength to carry on. For Alexandre, the return home was bittersweet. He had accomplished so much, achieved victories that would be remembered for centuries, but he had also seen the cost of his ambition, the lives lost in the pursuit of his dreams. As they marched westward, he often found himself lost in thought, reflecting on the journey they had taken and the challenges they had overcome. The return to Macedonia was not the triumphant march that Alexander had once imagined. It was a journey marked by hardship, by the loss of friends and comrades, and by the realization that even the greatest leaders must face the consequences of their decisions. But as they crossed the mountains and saw the familiar lands of Greece stretching out before them, a sense of peace began to settle over the army. They were finally home, the long journey over. The men who had left as young soldiers now returned as seasoned warriors, forever changed by what they had experienced. For Alexander, the return home was not the end of his story, but it was a turning point. He had seen the world, conquered empires, and faced trials that would have broken lesser men. Now, as he stood on the soil of Macedonia once more, he knew that his greatest battles were behind him, but the legacy he had created would endure. The return home was a moment of reflection, of understanding the true meaning of leadership and the sacrifices that come with it. It was a chapter in the life of Alexander the Great that would be remembered not just for the victories won, but for the strength it took to bring his men safely back to the land they called home. Chapter 11. The Death of a Conqueror. The city of Babylon was alive with the sounds of activity. The streets were bustling with traders, soldiers, and scholars, each going about their business under the warm sun. It was a city of great wealth and power, the jewel of Alexander the Great's vast empire. Yet, amidst this vibrant life, a shadow loomed, a shadow that would soon darken the entire world. It was the year 323 BC, and Alexander, still in the prime of his life, had returned to Babylon after years of relentless conquest. He had pushed the boundaries of his empire further than anyone had ever imagined. From Greece to Egypt, and from Persia to the edges of India. He was a man who seemed unstoppable, a leader who had never tasted defeat. But now, as he walked through the grand halls of his palace in Babylon, a sense of unease began to creep into the hearts of those around him. Alexander had always been a man of incredible energy and ambition, but lately something had changed. He appeared weary, his once bright eyes clouded with exhaustion. The constant demands of ruling an empire and the endless battles had taken their toll, though few dared to say it aloud. The man who had conquered the known world now seemed haunted by a burden that even he could not fully bear. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Alexander fell ill. It began with a sudden fever, a burning heat that seemed to radiate from within him. His physicians were summoned at once, but they could do little to ease his suffering. As the night wore on, the fever worsened, and Alexander's strength began to fade. Days passed, and the news spread quickly through the palace and beyond. Alexander, the great conqueror, was gravely ill. His generals and closest companions gathered by his side, their faces etched with worry. They had followed him across deserts, through jungles, and over mountains, always believing that he was invincible. But now, as they watched him lying on his bed, weakened and frail, they were forced to confront a reality they had never imagined. The fever raged on, and Alexander's condition continued to deteriorate. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in a voice so faint it was barely audible. He spoke of his campaigns, of battles fought and won, and of the cities he had founded. But he also spoke of things that troubled him, visions of the future, of an empire that might crumble without his guiding hand. As the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The physicians were at a loss, unable to explain the cause of his illness or how to cure it. Some whispered that it was the gods who had struck him down, punishing him for his hubris. Others believed it was poison, the work of enemies who had long waited for their chance to strike. But whatever the cause, it was clear that Alexander, the man who had seemed larger than life, was now in the grip of something beyond his control. On the 10th day of his illness, as the city of Babylon held its breath, Alexander called for his generals. They gathered around his bed, their expressions a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Alexander, his voice weak but steady, looked at each of them in turn. He knew that his time was short, that the empire he had built would soon be left in their hands. "Who will succeed you, my lord?" one of the generals asked, his voice breaking the silence. Alexander paused, a distant look in his eyes. Then, with a faint smile, he whispered, "To the strongest." These words, simple yet profound, sent a chill through the room. They were both a challenge and a warning, a reminder that the unity of the empire would depend on the strength and wisdom of those who came after him. But they also left a question unanswered, a question that would soon plunge the empire into chaos. Who among them was the strongest? As the hours passed, Alexander's condition worsened. His breathing became labored, and his skin, once tanned by the sun of many lands, grew pale and clammy. The great conqueror, who had once seemed immortal, was now a mere mortal, his life slipping away with each passing moment. In his final hours, Alexander's thoughts turned to his homeland, to the Macedonia he had left so many years ago. He spoke of the rivers and mountains of his youth, of the places where he had first dreamed of conquest. He remembered his mother, Olympias, and his father, Philip, the man who had set him on this path. And he thought of his soldiers, the men who had followed him to the ends of the earth, who had shared in his victories and his hardships. As the night deepened, the room fell silent. The generals and companions who had gathered around him could only watch as the life slowly ebbed from their leader. There was nothing more to be done, no battle left to fight. Alexander, the man who had conquered the world, was leaving it behind. Just before dawn, on June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great took his final breath. The man who had changed the course of history, who had brought entire empires to their knees, was gone. His death sent shock waves through the empire, a vast and sprawling realm that now found itself without its guiding light. In the days that followed, Babylon was filled with mourning. Soldiers wept openly in the streets, unable to comprehend the loss of their leader. The people, who had seen Alexander as a god among men, struggled to come to terms with his mortality. And in the palace, the generals and advisors who had once followed his every command now faced the daunting task of holding the empire together without him. The news of Alexander's death spread quickly across the empire, reaching the farthest corners of his domain. From Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India, the people who had lived under his rule reacted with shock and sorrow. They had believed that Alexander was destined for even greater things, that he would continue to expand his empire and bring peace to the world. But now, that dream had ended, and the future was uncertain. The empire that Alexander had built, so vast and powerful, now seemed fragile without his leadership. His death left a void that no one man could fill, and soon rivalries and conflicts began to emerge among his generals. The unity that Alexander had fought so hard to create was beginning to unravel. Yet, even in death, Alexander's legacy endured. The cities he had founded, the cultures he had connected, and the ideas he had spread continued to thrive long after he was gone. His empire, though eventually divided, left a lasting impact on the world, shaping the course of history for centuries to come. As the sun rose over Babylon, casting its light on the city that had witnessed the end of an era, the people knew that they had lived through a moment of great significance. Alexander the Great, the man who had dared to dream of a united world, was no more. But his story, filled with triumph and tragedy, would live on, inspiring generations to come. In the quiet of the early morning, as the city began to wake, the world seemed a little emptier, a little darker, without the presence of the man who had once seemed invincible. Alexander's death was a reminder of the fragility of life, even for those who achieve greatness. And so, the story of Alexander the Great came to an end, but his legend would never die. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Alexander. The dust had settled, and the echoes of battle had faded into the distant past, yet the legacy of Alexander the Great continued to shape the world long after his death. As the years passed, the story of the young Macedonian king who had conquered the known world grew into a legend, a tale of ambition, courage, and the complexities of power. But beyond the myths and the glory, what truly remained of Alexander's life was a lasting impact on history, culture, and civilization itself. Alexander's most enduring legacy was the spread of Greek culture, a process that historians would later call Hellenization. As Alexander's armies swept through Asia, they brought with them not only soldiers and weapons, but also the language, art, and ideas of Greece. In the cities and lands he conquered, Greek became the language of administration, trade, and learning. This fusion of Greek and local cultures created a new, vibrant civilization that blended the best of both worlds. One of the most significant contributions of this Hellenistic culture was the spread of Greek philosophy and science. In cities like Alexandria in Egypt, which Alexander himself had founded, scholars from different cultures came together to study and exchange ideas. The famous Library of Alexandria became a center of knowledge, housing thousands of scrolls and attracting thinkers from across the world. It was here that the seeds of modern science, mathematics, and philosophy were nurtured, laying the groundwork for future generations. But Alexander's legacy was not just intellectual, it was also physical. Throughout his empire, he founded more than 20 cities, many of which bore his name, Alexandria. These cities became hubs of culture and commerce, strategically placed along trade routes to connect east and west. The most famous of these was Alexandria in Egypt, which grew into one of the largest and most important cities of the ancient world. It was a place where different peoples and cultures met, exchanged ideas, and lived side by side, reflecting Alexander's vision of a unified world. However, Alexander's conquests also had darker consequences. The rapid expansion of his empire brought about significant disruption, as local populations were often forced to adapt to new rulers and new ways of life. The wars that Alexander waged left a trail of destruction, with cities destroyed and countless lives lost. His ambition, though extraordinary, came at a great human cost. Yet, despite the turmoil, Alexander's vision of a connected world endured. The trade routes that his conquests opened up allowed for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures on an unprecedented scale. Silk from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa found their way to the markets of Greece and Rome. This exchange enriched the cultures of all the regions involved, creating a more interconnected world that would continue to influence history long after Alexander's empire had fractured. Another aspect of Alexander's legacy was the way he became a symbol of leadership and ambition. Throughout history, many leaders and conquerors have looked to Alexander as a model of greatness. His name became synonymous with the idea of a heroic leader, one who dared to dream big and who was willing to risk everything to achieve his goals. But his life also served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the greatest of men are not immune to the dangers of hubris and the limits of human endurance. The myths that grew around Alexander's life only added to his legend. Stories of his exploits spread far and wide, often embellished or reinterpreted to fit the needs of different cultures. In some tales, he was portrayed as a god, a figure of divine power who had been chosen to rule the world. In others, he was a tragic hero, whose extraordinary talents were ultimately undone by his insatiable ambition. These stories kept his memory alive, inspiring both admiration and reflection. One of the most intriguing aspects of Alexander's legacy is the way it transcended the boundaries of the empire he had created. In the centuries that followed his death, his influence reached far beyond the lands he had conquered. In India, for example, the encounter with Alexander and his armies left a lasting impact on the subcontinent's culture and politics. Indian rulers adopted elements of Greek art and architecture, and the legend of Alexander found its way into Indian literature and folklore. In the Middle East, Alexander was remembered not just as a conqueror, but also as a bridge between East and West. The Persian Empire, which he had defeated, was transformed by the blending of Greek and Persian traditions. The city of Persepolis, once the heart of the Persian Empire, became a symbol of this cultural fusion. Even today, Alexander is a figure of fascination in the region, a reminder of the long and complex history that connects Europe and Asia. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Alexander's legacy is the way he inspired future generations to dream of a better world. His vision of a united empire where different cultures could coexist and learn from each other remains a powerful idea. While his empire ultimately fragmented after his death, the dream of unity and cooperation that he embodied continues to resonate. In many ways, Alexander's life was a testament to the power of imagination. The idea that with enough determination, one person can change the course of history. As we reflect on the legacy of Alexander the Great, it is important to remember that his story is not just about conquest and power. It is also a story of the complexities of leadership, the challenges of ambition, and the ways in which our actions can shape the world around us. Alexander was a man of extraordinary talent and vision, but he was also human, with all the strengths and flaws that come with it. For learners of English, the story of Alexander offers valuable lessons about history, culture, and the impact of individual actions. It shows how one person's life can influence the course of entire civilizations, and how the choices we make can have far-reaching consequences. It also reminds us that while greatness can be achieved, it often comes with a price. In the end, the legacy of Alexander the Great is a complex and multifaceted one. It is a legacy of both achievement and tragedy, of cultural exchange and conflict, of dreams realized and dreams left unfulfilled. But above all, it is a legacy that continues to inspire us to reach beyond the ordinary, to explore the unknown, and to imagine a world where different cultures and ideas can come together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. As the story of Alexander the Great comes to a close, we are left with the image of a young king who dared to dream of a world united by knowledge, culture, and shared ideals. His life was a journey of exploration and discovery, and his legacy is a reminder that the impact of our actions can echo through the ages, shaping the world in ways we can only begin to imagine.